The billionaire slammed a $4,000 bottle of French wine onto the table and pointed straight at the waiter's face. "You. Translate that for the help." The restaurant went silent. Every head turned toward one man standing at the end of the bar, a single father in a worn jacket, calloused hands gripping a notepad. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. And then he opened his mouth, and what came out of it stopped every person in that room cold. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't forget to subscribe. This one's going to stay with you. The bottle hit the white tablecloth hard enough to rattle every glass within 6 feet. Not an accident. Not clumsiness. A statement. Richard Callaway III didn't do anything by accident. The man had spent 62 years on this earth turning every single moment, every handshake, every dinner reservation, every glance across a crowded room into a calculated performance. He was the kind of man who wore a watch worth more than most people's cars, not because he needed to know the time, but because he needed you to know that he knew. He was the founder and majority shareholder of Callaway Capital Group, a private equity firm headquartered in a glass tower in downtown Seattle that reflected the clouds back at the sky, as if the building itself refused to look down. He had appeared on the cover of Forbes, twice been photographed at galas beside senators, and was known in certain circles for having the rare combination of extreme intelligence and absolutely zero patience for anyone he considered beneath him, which, if you spent more than 20 minutes with Richard Callaway III, turned out to be nearly everyone. The restaurant was called Maison Laurel. It sat on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Hotel in downtown Seattle, the kind of place where the menu had no prices, and the wine list came in a leather-bound book thicker than most novels. The view stretched across Elliott Bay, and on a clear night you could see the mountains beyond the water, white-capped and indifferent. Tonight was a Thursday. The dining room was at about 70% capacity, enough people to create the low, warm murmur of sophisticated conversation, but not crowded enough that anyone felt rushed. Every table had fresh flowers. Every glass was hand-polished before service began. The staff moved through the room with the practiced ease of people who had been trained to disappear when needed and appear precisely when not yet asked. Daniel Mercer had been doing this job for 3 years. He was 36 years old. Not tall, not short, somewhere in the middle, with the kind of build that comes from a life of physical work, not gym memberships. His hands were rough along the knuckles from the repair jobs he took on weekends and evenings, the side work that helped cover what his restaurant salary couldn't. He had brown eyes that paid close attention to things, the kind of eyes that learned from watching. His dark hair was always combed neatly before a shift, and he kept his uniform pressed because Mia, his 9-year-old daughter, told him once that he looked like a real gentleman in it, and he hadn't been able to stop pressing it since. He was a good waiter. Quiet when quiet was needed, present when presence was required. He had a memory that the head sommelier once described as borderline supernatural. He could recall wine vintages, dietary restrictions, seating preferences, and the names of guests' children from visits that happened 6 months prior. The restaurant manager, a meticulous woman named Christine Park, had put him on the high-value tables 3 months into his employment and kept him there ever since. Table 12 was the corner booth, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, a private view. The booth seats were upholstered in dark green velvet, and the table was wider than most, designed to accommodate business dinners. Quiet power meetings, the kind of conversations that moved money in large quantities. Richard Callaway had reserved table 12. He arrived with 2 other men, both younger, both wearing suits that cost as much as Daniel's monthly rent, both carrying the slightly anxious energy of people trying very hard to seem relaxed in the presence of someone who could end their careers with a phone call. One was Marcus Webb Callaway's senior vice president of acquisitions, mid-40s, thin in the way that suggested chronic stress rather than discipline. The other was James Fontaine, a French national and the European director of a hospitality group that Callaway Capital was in the process of acquiring or attempting to. The deal Daniel didn't know. The tension between the 3 men he could read immediately. It was the kind of tension that came from negotiation from two sides wanting something from each other and neither willing to show it directly. Daniel took their drink orders without incident. Water still for Calloway, sparkling for Webb, still for Fontaine. He brought a breadbasket. He recited the evening's specials with precision, all standard. Then Calloway asked for the wine list. Daniel brought it. Calloway opened it without looking up, flipped to a specific page. Not browsing, not considering going directly, and tapped a finger on a line item with the confidence of a man who had made this selection before. "Chateau Margaux," he said. "2015. Bring it." "Of course, sir," Daniel said. "Excellent choice." Calloway looked up for the first time. He looked at Daniel the way a person looks at a piece of furniture they are assessing for replacement. Not hostile, just utterly indifferent. "That's what you're supposed to say?" Calloway said, and went back to his menu. Marcus Webb gave a short, tight laugh. The kind of laugh that means, "I know this is uncomfortable, but I'm paid to find everything he says amusing." Daniel brought the wine. He presented the bottle. He opened it correctly, offered the taste received, approval poured with the appropriate restraint. He was professional. He was invisible in the way that good service required. That should have been the end of it. But Richard Calloway had not built a $2.4 billion empire by being content with the beginning of things. Joink. The dinner had been going for 40 minutes when Fontaine, who had been quiet and watchful, drinking his wine slowly and eating with the careful deliberateness of someone stalling, asked a question in French. It wasn't directed at Daniel. He was at an adjacent station just close enough to hear. The question was for Calloway, or perhaps for Webb, but neither of them spoke French with any fluency, and Fontaine knew it. That was the point. Fontaine's question translated amounted to a polite but firm challenge. He wanted to know whether the acquisition terms included a clause protecting the existing employment structure of his Paris-based staff, or whether Calloway Capital intended to restructure immediately post-acquisition, the way they had with the Berlin Hotel Group 18 months ago, which had resulted in significant layoffs. It was a smart, careful move. Asking it in French at a dinner table made it difficult to answer directly without a translator, and it also signaled to Fontaine's own internal sense of pride that he was not simply rolling over. He was a man negotiating in his native language. He had chosen the ground. Calloway set down his fork. He was not flustered. The man was never flustered, but his jaw tightened slightly. He turned and looked toward the wait station, and then he did what Richard Calloway did when he needed something and didn't want to show that he needed it. He made it a performance instead. He snapped his fingers. Not in the subtle way. The sharp, loud way. The way you call a dog. Every head at nearby tables turned. Daniel turned. "You," Calloway said, pointing directly at him. "Come here." Daniel walked to the table. "Yes, sir. Is there something I can help you with? Tell me something." Calloway leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, the posture of a man who owned every room he walked into. "You speak French?" There was a tone under the question. Daniel had spent enough years in service to hear what wasn't being said. The tone said, "I need a translator, but I refuse to admit it, so I'm going to frame this as an assessment of your qualifications, which I already assume are minimal." "A little, sir," Daniel said. Calloway reached out and picked up the wine bottle from the ice bucket beside the table. He turned it to show the label as though Daniel hadn't been the one to bring it, to open it, to pour it. "Tell our French friend here," Calloway said with the particular slow deliberateness of someone performing for an audience they've decided to create, "that I paid $4,000 for this bottle, and that if he doesn't stop stalling and give me a straight answer by the time we finish it, I'm going to withdraw my offer, and he can explain to his board why he lost a $200 million acquisition over a labor clause." He held the bottle out toward Daniel like a prop. "Go on," Calloway said. "Translate." Webb shifted in his seat. Fontaine watched. The couple at the nearest table had gone quiet. Daniel looked at the bottle. He looked at Calloway. And in the space of 2 or 3 seconds, a span of time that felt much longer from the inside, something happened in Daniel Mercer's expression that people standing nearby would later struggle to describe accurately. It wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. It was something more composed than either. Something that came from a place that had already done the hard work of deciding who it was. Daniel set his tray on the nearby stand. He turned to James Fontaine, and he spoke. In French. Fluid, unaccented natural French, not the halting, apologetic French of a tourist, but the French of someone who had lived inside the language. Monsieur Fontaine, je suis désolé pour la façon dont ceci vous est présenté. Ce que Monsieur Calloway souhaite vous communiquer, c'est que sa proposition reste conditionnelle à votre accord avant la fin de ce dîner. Il est également bien qu'il ne le formulerait pas ainsi préoccupé par le précédent de Berlin, et espère que vous comprendrez que sa position sur les structures d'emploi est négociable dans un cadre raisonnable. Fontaine blinked. Then he straightened. Something shifted in his face, the careful blankness of a man in negotiation, giving way to something that might, under different lighting, have been called relief. He responded in French. You speak very well. Thank you for the interpretation. Calloway had gone very still. What did you say to him? He asked Daniel. The performance was gone. The question was direct. I translated your message, sir, Daniel said, with a small adjustment in framing. What adjustment? I removed the threat and kept the offer. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room without anyone saying anything to fill it. Webb had stopped pretending to look at his menu. Fontaine was watching Daniel with open interest now. Calloway stared at him. Where did you learn French? He said. And the way he said it was different from anything he'd said before. Not dismissive, not performative, just a question. The first real question he had asked anyone at the table all evening. Daniel could have given a short answer. He could have deflected, could have said, college, sir, or I traveled a bit, and let the moment pass. He didn't. Not because he wanted to make a point. Not because he was angry, though anyone observing him would have been forgiven for expecting anger. He didn't deflect because he had spent enough of his life making himself smaller for the comfort of people who had decided in advance that he wasn't worth full size. My wife taught me, Daniel said. Something in his voice changed on those 4 words. Not loudly, not dramatically, just changed. The way a room changes when a window opens and the outside comes in. She was from Lyon, he continued. We met in Portland at a bookstore. She was trying to find an American edition of a novel she'd already read in French because she wanted to compare the translation. I thought that was the strangest and most interesting reason I'd ever heard for being in a bookstore, and I told her so. Calloway hadn't moved. She was a nurse, Daniel said. Pediatric oncology. She worked with sick children, and she was one of those people who had the ability to walk into a room where the worst possible thing was happening and somehow make it slightly less terrible. I don't know how people are built that way, but she was. The dining room around them had taken on a particular quality of quiet. The couple at the nearest table had stopped pretending to look at their food. She died 4 years ago, Daniel said. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in April, gone by November. We had 7 months. He paused, not for effect, because that's where the breath went. She made me learn French because she said she wanted us to be able to fight in 2 languages, he said. She said if we could argue in French, we'd understand each other better in English. The corner of his mouth moved. She was right about most things. Fontaine, without any attempt to hide it, had set down his wine glass. Calloway was looking at Daniel with an expression that was not identifiable as any of the expressions Daniel had seen from him so far that evening. I also speak German, Daniel said. My grandmother was from Stuttgart. She lived with us until I was 14, and she refused to speak English at home, which I resented at the time, and am deeply grateful for now. He looked at Webb, who appeared to have forgotten entirely that he was at a business dinner. Spanish I learned during a construction job in Phoenix 3 summers in a row, working with a crew from Sonora. They were patient with me, and also very funny about how badly I pronounced things at first. He looked back at Calloway. And Mandarin, my daughter's school has a dual language program. She's 9. She's already better than I am, but I practice with her every morning before school so she doesn't leave me too far behind. Another pause. That's 5, he said. In case you were counting. Richard Calloway was in fact counting. He was also doing something he had not done in a professional context in longer than he could clearly remember. He was recalibrating. Not the deal. The deal was still running in the background. That part of his brain never fully stopped, but his read of the room. His read of the man standing across from him. He had walked into this restaurant tonight with a very clear picture of how the evening would go. He had done it 100 times. You controlled the space by controlling the tempo. You picked the wine, you set the terms, you made clear, through every small gesture and every deliberate silence, that you were the axis around which the conversation rotated. He had looked at Daniel Mercer and seen a waiter, which was what Daniel Mercer was. But it was not apparently all that Daniel Mercer was. And Richard Calloway, whatever else could be said about him, and there was much, was not stupid. He had built what he had built partly by being willing to update his assessments when new information arrived. The men who didn't do that tended in his experience to eventually be destroyed by their own certainty. He picked up his wine glass. He held it for a moment without drinking. "Sit down," he said. Daniel blinked. "Sir, there's an empty chair at the table behind you. Pull it over and sit down." "Mr. Calloway, I'm working." "I'll speak to Christine," Calloway said, referring to the manager by her first name, which told Daniel immediately that Calloway had eaten here often enough and spent enough money that the formalities had long since collapsed. "Sit down." Daniel stood for a moment in the particular stillness of a man deciding something. Then he pulled the chair over and sat. The next 20 minutes were unlike anything that had happened at Table 12, or from what the nearby tables could piece together in the retelling afterward, anything that had happened in the restaurant in recent memory. Calloway asked questions, real questions, the kind he usually performed rather than actually asked. He asked where Daniel had gone to school. Daniel told him, University of Washington, full scholarship, double major in linguistics and history, graduated in the top 8% of his class. "Why are you waiting tables?" Calloway asked. Not cruelly, genuinely. "I own a repair business," Daniel said. "Small appliances, electronics, some contracting. It's been growing steadily. But the restaurant covers our health insurance, and until the business gets big enough to cover that reliably on its own, I need the steadiness." "Our health insurance," Calloway repeated. "My daughter and me." Calloway nodded once. "What's your daughter's name?" "Mia." "How old?" "9. She wants to be an architect. She draws buildings on every piece of paper she can find, including on one occasion the back of a permission slip that I discovered too late." For the first time all evening, Richard Calloway smiled. It was a different smile from the performance one's smaller, less constructed. "My daughter wanted to be a marine biologist until she was 12, he said. "Then she decided on corporate law and hasn't wavered since. She starts at Sullivan and Cromwell in September." "You must be proud," Daniel said. "I am," Calloway said. And there was something in the way he said it, brief, a little unguarded, that suggested the pride was complicated by things he wasn't going to discuss at a dinner table. Fontaine had been watching this exchange with the quiet attention of a man who has realized he is witnessing something more interesting than the meeting he thought he was attending. Webb had given up any pretense of involvement and was simply watching. Calloway looked at the wine bottle. Still some left. He picked it up, turned to Daniel, and did something that made Marcus Webb's eyebrows go up far enough to be anatomically notable. He poured a glass and set it in front of Daniel. "Tell me about your business," Calloway said. Daniel looked at the glass of wine. He did not drink it immediately. He looked at it the way you look at something you didn't expect and aren't sure yet what to do with. Then he looked at Calloway. "Why?" he asked. And Calloway, who was not used to being asked why, almost laughed. "Because," he said, "I just had 20 people in my building this week tell me about their businesses, and every one of them said exactly what they thought I wanted to hear. You haven't said a single thing I expected." Daniel picked up the glass. He turned it slightly in the light. not performing just a habit the way his wife had taught him to observe wine before drinking it. Mercer Repair, he said. I started it 2 years after Elena died because I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't grief. I grew up watching my father fix things. He was an engineer who spent his weekends taking broken things apart and putting them back together, and somewhere along the way, I absorbed that. When everything in my life felt like it was past the point of repair, the only thing that made sense was to repair something I could actually fix. He took a sip of the wine. I started with small appliances, toasters, radios, coffee machines. People in the neighborhood brought things. Word spread. I started doing electronics, televisions, speakers, vintage audio equipment. Then I added light contracting electrical, some plumbing, nothing that requires a full contractor's license, though I'm working on that. Revenue? Calloway asked. Last year, $212,000. This year is tracking toward $280,000. I have 3 part-time employees, and I'm in the process of hiring a 4th. Calloway absorbed this. You're managing that and this. I work the restaurant Thursday through Saturday. The shop is Tuesday, Wednesday, and by appointment on weekends. Mia is with my neighbor on restaurant nights. That's not sustainable. No, Daniel agreed. I'm aware. That's why I'm hiring. There was something in that exchange, the directness of it, the absence of defensiveness, that seemed to recalibrate the room again. Fontaine leaned forward. Monsieur Mercer, he said, in careful but confident English. May I ask, when you translated for us earlier, you changed the message, not just the framing. You removed the threat entirely and replaced it with an acknowledgement of the concern. Yes, Daniel said. Why? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Because the threat wasn't going to work, he said. Mr. Calloway is skilled at leverage, but threats at a dinner table with wine. This could put people in a corner they feel they have to fight their way out of. You weren't stalling because you wanted to hold up the deal. You were stalling because no one had acknowledged that what happened in Berlin was a legitimate concern. Fontaine nodded slowly. And what do you know about Berlin? Calloway asked, his voice neutral, in the way that meant he was paying maximum attention. I know that when Calloway Capital acquired the Richter Group 18 months ago, 43% of the existing staff was restructured out within 60 days. I know because I read about it in the journal, and because one of the Richter Group's former employees now lives 2 streets over from me and told me about it at a school event last spring. He paused. She's a good person. She had a hard year. The table was very quiet. You read the journal, Calloway said. Every morning, before Mia wakes up, I read the journal The Times and one French newspaper because otherwise I start losing vocabulary. Marcus Webb made a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a laugh and quickly converted it into a sip of water. Calloway looked at Daniel for a long moment. Then he turned to Fontaine. The Employment Protection Clause, he said. 2 years. Standard not enhanced. I'm not running a charity, but 2 years with a clear transition process and 30 days written notice per affected position. Fontaine looked at him. That is, Fontaine said carefully, a significant movement from your morning position. It's a reasonable position, Calloway said, which I should have led with. He did not say this with particular warmth, but he said it. He picked up his glass. Fontaine picked up his. They drank. When Daniel stood to return to his station, Calloway said one more thing. Mercer. Daniel turned. You said your business is tracking toward 280 this year. Yes. What would you need to get it to $1 million within 3 years? Daniel was very still. That's a different conversation, he said. I know, Calloway said. I'm asking if you want to have it. There was a long pause. Daniel looked at the man across the table. The man who had snapped his fingers, who had used him as a prop, who had decided before the evening began exactly what kind of person Daniel Mercer was, and who had, over the course of a single bottle of wine and 20 minutes of unplanned conversation, arrived somewhere entirely different. I work until 11, Daniel said. I take the 11:15 bus. "I'll have a car waiting," Calloway said. "We can talk on the way." Daniel nodded once. He picked up his tray. He walked back to his station. Christine Park was watching from near the host stand. She had seen most of it. She looked at Daniel with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between concern and something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of attention. "Everything all right with table 12? She asked. "Yes," he said. "You sat down with a guest." "I did." "Mr. Calloway requested it." "He did." She studied him. "Okay," she said, and let it go. The rest of the shift passed the way shifts do when something significant has already happened, and the remaining hours are just hours. He checked on his other tables. He brought food. He answered questions about the menu. Recommended wines, handled a minor issue with an overcooked steak, with the calm efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that most problems in restaurants were solvable if you just didn't make them larger than they were. At 9:40, he stepped outside for his break. The air outside the Meridian was cool and wet, the way Seattle air was in spring, with the particular smell of rain that had fallen 2 hours earlier and was still present in the concrete. He pulled out his phone and texted his neighbor Claire, who watched Mia on his restaurant nights. "How's she doing?" The response came in under a minute. "Asleep. She made me read the same chapter of her book 3 times because she said I wasn't doing the voices right." "She's correct. I'm not." Daniel smiled at his phone. He texted back, "Thanks. I'll be home by midnight." He stood in the cool air for a moment longer. He thought about what Calloway had asked. What would you need to get it to $1 million within 3 years? The honest answer was complicated. Capital, yes. A reliable second location, possibly. The right hires people who cared about the work, not just the paycheck. Time, which was the thing he was always running out of. But underneath all of that was a different question, the one he hadn't been asked, but that the evening had put in front of him anyway. What did he actually want? Not for the business. Not for the income. Not for the practical scaffolding of surviving. What did he want? He thought about Elena. He thought about the way she used to ask him that question directly, without apology, as if she found it genuinely strange that he couldn't answer something so obvious. "What do you want, Daniel? I want you to be okay," he would say. That's not an answer she would say. "What do you want for yourself?" He'd never been very good at that answer. He went back inside. At 11 o'clock, he turned in his apron and signed out. He walked through the Meridian lobby toward the exit and stopped when he saw Richard Calloway standing near the entrance, not waiting. The way most people waited. Shifting weight, checking a phone, but simply standing perfectly still, as if he had arrived exactly when he meant to and would not move until the precise correct moment. The car was outside. Daniel could see it through the glass, a black sedan idling. Calloway looked at him. "You don't have to come," he said. It was... Daniel realized the most honest thing the man had said all evening. "I know," Daniel said. He pushed open the door. They walked out together into the Seattle night, the billionaire who had snapped his fingers at a waiter, and the single father who had answered in 5 languages and changed the terms of the room. Neither of them knew exactly where the conversation would go. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel Mercer was curious to find out. And that is how a night that began with a $4,000 bottle of wine and a snap of a man's fingers became something none of them expected. Not Calloway, not Fontaine, not Webb, and certainly not the single father who had spent 3 years making himself invisible at table 12. But what happened in the car that night? What Calloway offered? What Daniel almost said yes to? And the phone call that interrupted everything and changed the direction of both their lives. That is another story entirely. The car was warm and quiet, the kind of quiet that costs money. The sound insulation alone in a vehicle like this probably ran more than Daniel made in a month. He sat in the back seat with his jacket still on his hands in his lap and watched the lights of downtown Seattle move past the window without really seeing them. Richard Calloway sat on the other side of the seat, Not close, not distant. He had his phone in his hand, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at Daniel. "You're wondering what this is," Calloway said. "I'm wondering a few things," Daniel said. "Ask." Daniel turned from the window. "Why me specifically? You've had hundreds of meetings with people who want something from you. You've had people pitch you in elevators at charity dinners on golf courses. What made tonight different?" Calloway was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone avoiding the question, the silence of someone deciding how much truth to use. "Most people who want something from me come prepared," he said. "They've researched me, rehearsed what they're going to say, decided in advance which version of themselves to present. There's a word for it, positioning. Everyone positions. And I didn't. You didn't even know you were in the room," Calloway said. "You were just there, being what you are. And what you did at that table, the translation, the adjustment, the way you read Fontaine before I did that, wasn't positioning. That was just you thinking clearly under pressure." Daniel considered this. "You snapped your fingers at me." "I know. Like I was a dog." "I know that too." There was no apology in Calloway's voice. But there was something else, a flatness, an absence of the performance that had been present all evening. He wasn't defending the gesture. He was just acknowledging it the way you acknowledge weather. "Does that bother you?" Calloway asked. "It did," Daniel said. "For about 30 seconds. Then I decided it was more useful to be interested in what came next." Calloway looked at him. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly what I'm talking about." The car moved through a light. Daniel could feel the city outside, the wet streets, the late-night energy of a Thursday in Seattle, people leaving bars and restaurants, the ordinary machinery of other people's evenings, continuing without any awareness of this particular conversation happening inside this particular car. "Tell me what you actually need," Calloway said. "Not what you think I want to hear. Not a pitch. What does Mercer Repair actually need to grow?" Daniel had been turning this over since the moment Calloway asked it at the table. He had spent the last 2 hours of his shift mentally cataloging the answer, the way he mentally cataloged everything carefully without rushing. "2 things," he said. "Capital for a second location and a reliable supply chain for parts. Right now I source individually, which means my margins are inconsistent and my turnaround time on specialty items is unpredictable. If I could negotiate volume agreements with 2 or 3 suppliers, my cost basis drops significantly, and I can give clients accurate timelines instead of estimates." "How much capital for the second location?" "Done right, $220 to $250 to build out the space and cover operating costs for 6 months while it ramps. Done cheaply, $160, but then I'm compromising on equipment and I lose the quality control that makes the first location work." "You've modeled this." "I have a spreadsheet," Daniel said. "It's not a Goldman Sachs deck, but the numbers are real." Calloway almost smiled. "What's your current margin?" "Net 31%. Calloway raised an eyebrow. For a small repair operation with inconsistent supply chains, that was not an insignificant number. "How?" "I don't waste anything," Daniel said simply. "I don't hire people I don't need. I don't pay for space I don't use. And I've gotten very good at knowing which jobs are worth taking and which ones are going to cost me more than they earn." "What kind of jobs do you turn down?" "Jobs where the client doesn't respect the work. People who think repair is cheaper than replacement and then complain when it takes time." He paused. "I've learned that a customer who doesn't value what you do will find a way to make even a successful job feel like a failure. So I don't take them." Calloway sat with that for a moment. "You could scale faster if you lowered your standards," he said. "Not a suggestion, a test. I could scale faster and build something I don't want to own," Daniel said. "I've watched businesses do that. They get big and hollow at the same time. I'd rather grow slower and keep it real." The car stopped at a light. Somewhere outside, a group of people spilled out of a bar, laughing loud enough to be audible even through the insulation. For just a second, the outside world pushed in, and then the light changed, and it was gone. I'm going to ask you something personal, Calloway said. You've been asking me personal things for the last hour. This is more personal. Daniel waited. The business, Calloway said. The restaurant shifts. The spreadsheets at 5 in the morning before your daughter wakes up. Is this what you want? Or is this what grief looks like when it finds a direction? The question landed somewhere Daniel hadn't expected. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the car made 2 turns before he answered. Both, he said finally. It started as the second thing. I needed to work because if I stopped working, I had to sit inside what had happened, and I wasn't ready for that. But somewhere in the middle of the second year, it turned into something else. I started caring about it for itself, about the craft of it, about the people who brought things in. There's a woman who brings me her mother's sewing machine every 6 months for maintenance. The machine is from 1961. It's in better shape than most things made last year because she cares for it. She talks to me about her mother while I work on it. He paused. That's not grief. That's something I want to be part of. Calloway didn't respond immediately. He looked out his own window. My wife left me 11 years ago, he said. It came out with no setup, no context the way things come out when someone has been carrying them a long time, and the weight becomes briefly shareable. Not because I was unkind, because I was absent, physically present and completely absent, and she eventually ran out of patience for the distinction. Daniel said nothing. He understood that the correct response was silence. My daughter grew up mostly with her mother, Calloway continued. I sent money and I came to important things, and I told myself that was enough because the work was important. The work was always important. He stopped. She's 26 now. She's brilliant. She's going to be extraordinary at whatever she does. And she's perfectly carefully polite to me at Christmas, and calls me twice a year on schedule. He turned back from the window. That's what building something at the cost of everything else actually costs, he said, in case the math wasn't clear. It was the most unguarded thing Daniel had heard a powerful man say in years, possibly ever. There was no strategy in it, no positioning. It was just a man in a car at 11:30 at night telling the truth to a stranger because something about the stranger had made truth feel like the available option. Why are you telling me this? Daniel asked. Because you asked what made tonight different, Calloway said. And I think part of the answer is that you reminded me of what I was before all of this became a performance. The car slowed. Daniel looked up and realized they were on his street, which meant Calloway had already known his address, had given it to the driver, had planned this route before Daniel even walked out of the restaurant. He filed that away without comment. The car stopped in front of his house. The lights were off except for the lamp in the front room, which he always left on a habit from when Mia was afraid of the dark that had outlasted the fear itself. Daniel looked at the house, then he looked at Calloway. What exactly are you proposing? He said. I want to invest, Calloway said. Not acquire, invest. Minority stake, silent operational role, standard terms. You run the business, I provide capital and supply chain access. Calloway Capital has relationships with 17 electronics distributors globally. I can get you better parts at better prices than you could negotiate independently for the next decade. In exchange for what percentage? 20. Daniel was quiet. That's low for what you're offering, he said. I know. Why? Calloway looked at him steadily. Because 20% of something that grows the way I think this can grow is worth considerably more to me than 40% of something run by a man who resents my involvement. It was, Daniel had to admit, a logical answer. It was also not the complete answer, and they both knew it. I need to think about it, Daniel said. Of course. And I need to show you the actual numbers, not summarized, the real spreadsheet. Send it to me. Marcus will give you my contact. Daniel nodded. He put his hand on the door handle, then he stopped. Mr. Calloway. Richard? Richard. He paused, and in the pause, something shifted in the quality of what he was about to say. When you snapped your fingers at me tonight, I want you to know that the reason I didn't react wasn't because it didn't land. It was because I've learned that the most important thing in a room is rarely the loudest thing. Calloway was very still. My wife taught me that too, Daniel said. He got out of the car. He walked up the path to his front door without looking back. Behind him, he heard the car stay for a moment, idling, not leaving, and then pull away. He unlocked the door. Inside the house was the specific quiet of a child asleep. A different quality of quiet from any other, something he had learned to recognize and had never been able to fully describe to anyone who hadn't experienced it. He hung up his jacket. He checked on Mia. She was asleep on her side, one arm around the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 3, her dark hair spread across the pillow. On her desk beside the bed, there was a drawing, a building tall and angular with careful little windows drawn in pencil, and what appeared to be a rooftop garden, rendered with the determined optimism of a 9-year-old architect. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he went to the kitchen and made himself a cup of tea, and sat at the table with his laptop and opened the spreadsheet. Not to send to Calloway. Not yet. Just to look at it. To see it clearly. To sit with what the evening had put in front of him and decide what he actually thought about it without the pressure of a car and a man's attention. He looked at the numbers for a while. Then he looked up at the kitchen window at the dark outside. He thought about what Calloway had said. What grief looks like when it finds a direction. Both he had answered, and that was true. But there was something else that was also true. Something he hadn't said in the car because he hadn't fully formed it yet, and he wasn't in the habit of saying half-formed things to men who traded in precision. He was afraid, not of failure. He had failed before and survived it. Not of growth, he wanted growth. The spreadsheet was full of growth he had planned for with careful, patient attention. He was afraid of what happened when the thing you built to survive grief became successful enough that survival was no longer the point. When the reason you started something was gone and the something remained. What did you want it to be then? He closed the laptop. He finished his tea. He went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about a woman from Lyon who had taught him to argue in French and to pay attention to wine and to ask himself without apology what he actually wanted. He didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time in 4 years, he thought he might be getting closer to the right question. He was almost asleep when his phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from an unknown number, Marcus Webb. Card attached. RC said to tell you the offer expires in 30 days. Also said to tell you that's not a deadline, it's a gesture of respect for the decision. His words, not mine. For what it's worth, I've worked for him for 9 years, and I have never seen him pour wine for a waiter before tonight. Daniel read the text twice. He set the phone face down on the nightstand. He lay in the dark. He thought Elena would have had an opinion about this. She would have had a very specific, very clear opinion delivered with the precise combination of warmth and directness that had been among many things the thing he missed most about being known by someone who knew him all the way through. He tried to hear her voice. Sometimes he could. The French came back most clearly, the sound of her accent on certain words, the rhythm of her sentences when she was making a point she found obvious and couldn't believe he was still debating. What would she say? He thought he knew. She would say, "Stop asking what Elena would think and figure out what Daniel thinks." He almost laughed in the dark. Right about most things he had told Calloway. That part was an understatement. He was almost asleep for the second time when he heard something that pulled him back. Not loud, just present. A sound from next door. He lay still, listening. It came again. Not a scream. Not like the last time. Something quieter. A sound he couldn't immediately place coming through the shared wall between his house and the house next door. His neighbor was Sarah Okafor, a woman in her mid-40s who worked in hospital administration and was unfailingly pleasant and almost entirely private. They had exchanged maybe 40 words in the 3 years he had lived here. She brought in her trash cans the same day he did. She waved when she saw him from the driveway. That was the extent of it. He lay still for another moment. The sound again. He sat up. He was not going to do this. He was tired. It was almost midnight. Whatever was happening next door was not his business, and he was the person who had just spent all evening being other people's solution, and he was going to stay in his bed. He got up. He put on his shoes. He grabbed the flashlight from the hall drawer by reflex, the same drawer he always grabbed it from. He went outside. The night was cold and still. His breath made a small cloud. He stood between the two houses and listened. Nothing now. He waited. Then from inside, through what sounded like the kitchen window on the side of the house facing him, a voice. Low, compressed the specific register of someone trying very hard not to make noise. And then, clearly, one word. His name. Daniel. Not loud, but certain. The way you say a name when it's the only word you have left. He went to the front door and knocked. A long pause, then footsteps. Then the door opened. Sarah Okafor stood in the doorway. She was still in her work clothes, which meant she had been home a short time, or hadn't changed at all. Her face was composed in the careful way that people compose themselves when they are using every available unit of energy to hold something together. Her eyes were red. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I didn't mean for you to hear." "What happened?" Daniel said. She pressed her lips together. The careful composure cracked very slightly at the edges. "Come in," she said. He came in. The house was the standard layout of their row, the same floor plan as his, but mirrored so everything was backward in the disorienting way of mirror image spaces. The front room had boxes, but not moving boxes, more like the boxes of someone who had recently received things or recently been through things. Papers on the table. A laptop open to what looked like a hospital employee portal. "I was let go today," Sarah said. She said it the way people say things when they have already said them so many times in their head that the words have worn smooth. After 11 years. Budget restructuring. They're outsourcing the department. "I'm sorry," Daniel said. "It's fine," she said, in the tone of voice that means it is not currently fine, but the person has decided that is the frame they are committing to. "It's not fine," he said. "Not at 11 years. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted at the refusal to accept the frame. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." She sat down. He sat down across from her. On the table between them was a cup of tea that had gone cold, a stack of papers that appeared to be financial documents, and a photograph, a woman who was clearly Sarah, 20 years younger, standing with a man Daniel didn't recognize somewhere outdoor and bright. "My ex-husband," Sarah said, following his gaze without his asking. "He passed away 3 years ago. We were separated, but still. He was my daughter's father." "Where is your daughter?" "College, Oregon." "She doesn't know yet." She looked at the cold tea. "I didn't want to call her at 11 o'clock on a Thursday and make it her problem." "It's not her problem," Daniel said. "But she'd probably want to know." Sarah looked at him. "You'd call Mia," she said. It wasn't a question. "The moment it happened," he said. Another small crack in the careful composure. She caught it and held it. "Your daughter's lucky," she said. "She'd argue with that on most mornings," Daniel said. "But I'll take it." Sarah almost smiled. It was brief and complicated, the smile of someone who is temporarily permitted to be almost okay before the weight reassembles. "I have an interview skill set from 11 years ago," she said. "The industry has changed. I don't know how much of what I know is still relevant. I don't know what my references look like since my direct supervisor was also let go." She paused. "I have 14 months of savings. After that?" 14 months is significant," Daniel said. "That's not a crisis. That's a runway." "I know that intellectually." "What does it feel like?" She looked at him. The question had caught her off guard in the specific way that direct questions catch people off guard when they expect to be handled rather than heard. "Like the floor moved," she said. "Like something I had built my footing on just shifted, and I don't know yet whether it's going to settle or keep moving." Daniel nodded. "I know that feeling," he said. She looked at him for a moment. They were two people who had known each other for 3 years and exchanged 40 words, and now it was nearly midnight, and something had broken open the ordinary distance between neighbors and made it temporarily irrelevant. "What did you do?" she asked, "when the floor moved for you?" He thought about it honestly. He didn't reach for the version that sounded better in retrospect. "I fixed things," he said. "Literally, I found broken things and I fixed them because that was the only action that produced a clear result. And eventually the fixing turned into something real." He paused. "But the first part, the part where you just get through the night, that part, was just about getting through the night. Nothing bigger than that." Sarah was quiet. "I made tea," she said. "Obviously cold tea, but I made it." "That counts," he said. She looked at the photograph again, then at the papers, then at him. "I'm sorry for saying your name," she said. "I didn't think anyone would hear. I was just saying it, like it was something to hold on to." Daniel felt something move in his chest, not dramatically, quietly, the way things move when they are true. "You don't have to apologize for that," he said. She nodded. He stayed for another half hour. He reheated the tea. He looked at her resume because she asked, and because he was genuinely useful at seeing structure, and told her 3 things that were strong and 2 things he would change. She made notes. She was sharp even at midnight on a bad day, the kind of sharp that doesn't go away when circumstances change. When he left, she walked him to the door. "Daniel," she said. He turned. "Thank you," she said. "For—" She stopped, tried again. "For not pretending it was fine when I said it was fine." He nodded. He walked back to his house. He locked the door behind him. He stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark and thought about 2 different things happening inside the same night: a man in a car offering him something that could change his future, and a woman through a wall who had just needed someone to hear her name. He thought about how much of life happened in the space between the large moments and the small ones. How the small ones were never actually small. He went back to bed. This time, he slept. In the morning, Mia was up before him, which happened sometimes when she had an idea she needed to work on before it slipped away. He found her at the kitchen table with graph paper and a ruler drawing a building with the precise seriousness of a professional who happened to be 9 years old. "What is it?" he asked. "A community repair center," she said without looking up. "Like your shop, but bigger, with a part on top where people can learn to fix things themselves, and a little library." He looked at the drawing. It was remarkably good. The proportions were considered. She had drawn small figures around the entrance to give scale. "When did you come up with this?" he said. "Last night." She looked up. "I dreamed it. I woke up and drew it so I wouldn't forget." He looked at his daughter, at the drawing, at the small figures she had drawn outside the building she had dreamed into existence. He thought about Calloway's question. What would you need to get it to 1 million within 3 years? He thought about his answer. He thought about the spreadsheet, the supply chains, the second location, the numbers he had been building toward. He looked at the drawing again. A community repair center, with a part where people can learn to fix things themselves, and a little library. He sat down across from her at the table. "Can I look at it?" he said. She slid it across to him carefully, the way she always handled things she had made. He looked at it for a long time. "This is really good, Mia," he said. She went back to drawing. "I know," she said, with the calm confidence of someone who has not yet learned to doubt what she makes. He looked at the building she had drawn. He looked at the small figures she had placed around the entrance. And then he looked at the rooftop where she had drawn in careful pencil lines what appeared to be a garden. He picked up his phone from the counter. He found Marcus Webb's text from the night before. He typed, "Tell Richard I'd like to meet again. I have some additional conditions I'd like to discuss." He set the phone down. He went to the stove and started making breakfast. Behind him, Mia hummed quietly over her drawing, adding detail, erasing a line, adding it again slightly differently. The morning light came through the window and fell across the graph paper and the ruler and the small, precise world she was building on the page. His phone buzzed. Marcus Webb. He says tomorrow. Noon. He'll come to you. Daniel read it once. He cracked an egg. He thought Richard Calloway was about to walk into a repair shop in a suburban neighborhood outside Seattle for a meeting with a former waiter, and he was going to do it at noon on a Friday, which meant he was rearranging his calendar, which meant last night had mattered to him in a way he wasn't going to say directly, but was demonstrating through logistics. People showed you who they were in the arrangements they made. He thought about that. He thought about Sarah next door, and her 14 months of runway, and her resume with the 2 things he would change. He thought about Mia's building on the graph paper. He thought there is something happening here that is larger than I can currently see the edges of. He didn't know yet what it was. But he was paying attention, and paying attention in Daniel Mercer's experience was the beginning of almost everything that mattered. The eggs were done. He plated them. He called Mia to the table. She came with her drawing, setting it carefully to the side where it wouldn't get food on it, and sat down, and immediately began eating with the focused efficiency of a child who has important work to return to. "Dad," she said between bites. "Yeah." "Do you think a building like that could actually work?" He looked at the drawing. "I think," he said, "that most things that actually work started as a drawing on graph paper." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Okay," she said, and went back to eating. He poured his coffee. He sat down at the table with his daughter in the morning light in the house that was theirs, in the life they had built out of what remained after the worst year of his life. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something that was not quite hope. Hope was too soft a word, too provisional, but something closer to readiness. Like a door he had been standing next to for a long time had finally come slightly open. Like the light on the other side was real. Richard Calloway arrived at 11:58. Daniel knew this because he was watching the clock above the workbench when he heard the car pull up outside, and he made a specific note of it, not because he was tracking punctuality as a power move, but because, in his experience, the way a person arrived told you something true about them. 2 minutes early meant Calloway had planned for traffic and planned to be ready. It meant he took this seriously enough to not be late. That mattered. Daniel had spent the morning preparing the shop the way he prepared everything, not by making it look like something it wasn't, but by making it fully clearly what it was. The workbenches were clean. The tools were organized. The 3 jobs currently in progress were set to the side, with their intake forms clipped neatly to each one. The small whiteboard on the wall had the week's schedule written out in his handwriting. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was staged. Mia was at school. Sarah from next door had texted at 8:30 to say thank you again, and that she had called her daughter in Oregon, and that her daughter had cried, and then immediately started problem solving, which Sarah said was the most comforting possible response. Daniel had texted back, "Good. That's what they're supposed to do." He was standing at the workbench when the door opened. Calloway walked in without knocking. Not rudely, the door had been propped open, which was Daniel's indication that he was expected. He walked in and stopped just inside and looked around the shop the way he had looked at Daniel in the restaurant taking inventory. Building a picture, deciding what things meant. He was wearing different clothes than the night before. Not casual exactly, but less formal. A jacket without a tie. He looked like a man who had made a deliberate choice about what to wear to a repair shop and had arrived at something that split the difference between his world and this one. "You're on time," Daniel said. "I'm always on time," Calloway said. "So am I," Daniel said. "I've found it's a reasonable baseline for deciding whether to trust someone." Calloway walked further into the shop. He looked at the workbenches, at the organized tools, at the 3 jobs in progress. He picked up the intake form on the nearest one and read it. Not scanning, actually reading. 1964 Grundig shortwave radio, he said. "A woman brought it in last week. It belonged to her father. He used it to listen to jazz broadcasts from Chicago when he was young. She wants it working again." Calloway set the form down carefully exactly where it had been. "What's the margin on a job like this? $42 labor parts, maybe 8. So roughly 70% margin on a $50 job. Not exactly your path to $1 million. No, Daniel said. But she'll tell 15 people, and she'll come back. And one of those 15 people will bring me something worth $400. The math works differently than it looks. Calloway looked at him. Word of mouth, and the fact that people remember how you made them feel. She's going to feel like her father's voice came back to her when she turns that radio on. That's not a transaction. That's a relationship. He paused. Relationships compound. Transactions don't. Something moved behind Calloway's eyes. He pulled out the chair from the corner Daniel's reading chair, the one he used on slow afternoons without asking, and sat down. It was a move that could have read as presumptuous. Instead, it read as someone making themselves present rather than performing. Tell me the conditions, Calloway said. Daniel leaned against the workbench. He had thought about this carefully, not just the numbers, but the structure, the things that mattered underneath the numbers. The first condition is operational autonomy, he said. Complete. Every hiring decision, every client relationship, every service offering. I'm not running this by a board or a VP of anything. You invest, you get your return, and you stay out of the shop. Agreed, Calloway said without hesitation. Daniel had expected at least a pause. The lack of one was information. The second condition is community reinvestment. 10% of net profit every quarter back into the neighborhood. Not a charity donation structured. A skills program. I want to teach repair to people who need a trade and can't afford vocational school. That's a non-negotiable cost built into the model from the start. Calloway was quiet for a moment. That affects your margin. I know. You're asking me to invest in a reduced margin. I'm asking you to invest in a business that will have a reason to still be here in 20 years, Daniel said. Businesses that give back to the communities they're in build loyalty that money can't manufacture. You can run the numbers on it if you want. I have. He reached behind the workbench and pulled out a folder. Inside was a printed document. Not a Goldman Sachs deck, exactly as he had said the night before, but something clean and organized. He set it on the workbench between them. Calloway leaned forward and picked it up. He was quiet for 2 full minutes while he read. Daniel didn't fill the silence. He had learned from Elena that silence was not a vacuum requiring words. It was space in which things could actually be considered. You built a customer lifetime value model, Calloway said, looking up. Page 4. Using word-of-mouth acquisition as your primary growth driver. Page 6. And you've projected community reinvestment as a marketing cost. Because that's what it is functionally. The difference is that it's a marketing cost that also does something real for real people. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Calloway set the folder down. Third condition, Daniel said. There's a third. Sarah Okafor, my neighbor. 11 years in hospital administration, let go yesterday in a budget restructuring. She knows operational systems, staff management, compliance documentation, and budget allocation better than anyone I've ever talked to about process. I want to hire her as operations manager when I open the second location. But I can't offer her a competitive salary yet. I need the investment to make that offer real. Calloway blinked. It was the first time all morning that Daniel had seen him genuinely surprised. You're negotiating someone else's job into your investment terms. I'm telling you that the right person for a key role in my business lost her job yesterday through no fault of her own, and that the timing of your offer means I can actually do something about it. Yes. Calloway looked at him for a long moment. Does she know you're doing this? Not yet. When were you planning to tell her? After I know whether the investment is real. Another pause. All right, Calloway said. Daniel looked at him. All right, as in, I accept all 3 conditions. I'll have Marcus draft the term sheet by end of business Monday. 20% stake, full operational autonomy, 10% quarterly community reinvestment built into the model, and a salary line for an operations manager at the second location. He folded his hands. Is there a fourth condition? Not yet, Daniel said. The corner of Calloway's mouth moved. Not yet, that's honest. I try to be. Calloway stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the street for a moment. Just the ordinary street, the neighborhood, the row of modest houses, and the mature trees and the sidewalk where a couple of kids were riding bikes in the Friday morning quiet. Can I ask you something that isn't about the business? He said. You can ask. Last night, when you talked about your wife, about learning languages from her, you said she taught you that the most important thing in a room is rarely the loudest thing. I remember. How do you still carry that? How do you still carry her without... He stopped, started differently. I have people around me constantly, advisors, staff, security assistants, and the space where something personal should be is completely empty. I look at you, you're running a repair shop and waiting tables and raising a child alone. And somehow, the thing you carry from your marriage is still alive in you. How? Daniel was quiet for a moment. I talked to her, he said. Calloway turned from the window. In my head, when I'm making a decision and I don't know what to do, I ask her what she thinks. I don't always get an answer, but asking the question means I have to think about what she would actually say, which means I have to think clearly about what I actually value. He paused. She's still the standard I'm measuring against. Not perfectly. I fail it constantly, but it's still there. Calloway was looking at him with the expression from the car the night before, the one that wasn't identifiable as any of his usual expressions. My ex-wife's name is Patricia, he said quietly. I don't think I've said her name out loud in 2 years. Daniel didn't say anything. I said everything I needed to say to her through lawyers, Calloway said. And then I stopped. And the children grew up and the business grew and I told myself I was fine. He paused. I'm not fine. No, Daniel said. But knowing that is somewhere. Calloway turned back to the window. My daughter starts at Sullivan and Cromwell in September, he said. It was the same sentence he had said the night before, but something in it was different this time. Fuller. I'm going to her apartment in New York in August to help her move in. She didn't ask me to. I'm going anyway. I decided last night. He said it like a man announcing a decision to himself as much as to anyone else. Good, Daniel said. Calloway nodded once, still looking out the window. Then, without turning around, the wine at the restaurant last night. The Margot. Yes. The waiter before you, the kid 20-something, he poured it wrong. Too fast, didn't check the temperature, didn't wait for it to breathe. You poured it correctly. I know, Daniel said. I noticed when I brought it over. Why didn't you correct it? Because it wasn't my job to correct it in front of the table. I opened a second decanting option when I brought it, set it nearby, let it breathe while you ate. By the time you'd had 2 glasses, you were drinking it at the right temperature anyway. A long silence. You fixed the problem without making anyone feel the problem existed, Calloway said. That's most of the job. Calloway turned from the window. That, he said, is most of leadership. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He moved toward the door, and then something stopped him. Not a thought. Something more physical than that. Some small urgency that hadn't finished arriving yet. He turned back. Mercer. Daniel looked at him. The snap, Calloway said. At the restaurant. He stopped. The word he was looking for wasn't one he used often, and the unpracticed quality of reaching for it was visible. That was not, I shouldn't have... Richard. Calloway stopped. You don't have to, Daniel said. I want to. I know, but the fact that you want to is enough. Save it. A beat of silence. Then Calloway nodded, and something in his face did something difficult and private and real. He walked out. Daniel stood in the shop and listened to the car pull away. Then he stood in the silence for a moment, looking at the Grundig radio on the workbench at the intake form with the woman's name and her father's voice, frozen in metal and wire, waiting to come back. He picked up his phone and texted Sarah. Are you home? The reply came in 40 seconds. Yes. Can I come over for a minute? Another pause. Longer this time. Then, of course. He locked the shop and walked next door. Sarah answered the door in the same work clothes from the night before, which told him she either hadn't slept or had gotten up and put them back on, which was its own kind of information. She looked at him with the careful eyes of someone who was still managing the perimeter of themselves. "Come in," she said. He came in. The papers were still on the table. The laptop was open on what now appeared to be a job listing site. She had been working. "I have something to tell you," he said. She read his face. "Good or bad?" "I think good, but I want to ask you first." He sat down at the table. She sat across from him. "I'm opening a second location of the repair shop," he said. "Financing came through this morning." He didn't explain the full shape of it, that part could come later. "I need an operations manager, someone who can handle systems, staffing, compliance budget, someone who knows how to build a functional organization and keep it functional." She looked at him. "Your resume is exactly right for that role," he said. "Your 11 years in hospital administration, the systems management, the staff oversight, the regulatory compliance work, all of it maps directly. The role would be full-time competitive salary equity, stake after 1 year." A very long silence. Sarah looked at the table, at the laptop with the job listings, at the photograph of her younger self, at Daniel. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "Because I need someone I trust," he said, "and I trust you. You barely know me. I know that when everything fell apart for you last night, you said it was fine and then sat alone trying to fix it. I know that when I came over, you were already making lists of what to do next. I know that the resume I looked at last night is from someone who built something real over 11 years and did it without anyone handing her anything." He paused. "That's not barely knowing someone. That's knowing what matters." Sarah pressed her lips together. The composure cracked again wider this time. "I have a daughter in college," she said. "I know. I have 14 months of savings, and then the math gets very tight. I know. If this doesn't work, you'll have 6 months of strong recent experience in a new industry to put on the next resume," he said, "and a reference from me that is honest about who you are." She was quiet. "What's the salary?" she said. He told her. She went very still. "That's more than I was making at the hospital," she said. "I know what hospital administrators make," he said. "This is what the role is worth." Another long silence. Then Sarah Okafor, who had been composed and contained and managing through the worst professional day of her adult life, put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then looked at Daniel and said very quietly, "Yes." He nodded. "Monday," he said. "We start the paperwork Monday." She nodded back. He stood. He was moving toward the door when she said his name. "Daniel." He turned. "Why did you come to my door last night? You were tired. You'd had a long evening. You didn't know me." He thought about it honestly. "I heard you say my name," he said, "through the wall, like it was something to hold on to." He paused. "Elena used to say that the people who need help the least loudly are often the ones who need it most urgently." Sarah looked at him. "She sounds like she was remarkable," she said. "She was right about most things," he said. He went home. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at nothing in particular for a while, which was his version of processing things that were happening faster than he had planned for. 2 days ago, he was a waiter with a repair shop and a tight budget and a 9-year-old drawing buildings on graph paper. Now he was sitting at his kitchen table with an investment agreement being drafted on the other end of a phone, an operations manager starting Monday, and the particular light-headed sensation of a life that had just changed shape faster than he could fully track. He pulled out Mia's drawing from where he'd propped it against the fruit bowl. The community repair center, with the rooftop garden. He looked at the small figures she'd drawn outside the entrance. He got a pen and a piece of paper and wrote, "Location 2 Community Repair Center Concept. Skills Program. Small library. Rooftop element. He looked at what he'd written. He thought his 9-year-old daughter had dreamed his business plan. He was going to need to have a conversation with her about intellectual property. He almost laughed at himself. His phone rang. Unknown number, Seattle area code. He answered. Mr. Mercer. A woman's voice, professional, efficient, but with a warmth underneath it that was not entirely professional. My name is Diana Park. I'm a reporter with the Seattle Times. I'm doing a piece on workforce innovation and small business resilience in the greater Seattle area, and I got your name from a few different people actually, which is why I'm calling. Which people? Daniel said. A brief pause. James Fontaine for one. He's in town through this weekend, and apparently you made quite an impression at dinner last night. He said, she seemed to be reading from notes, and I'm quoting here, he was the only honest person in the room. Daniel was quiet. He gave me your name and number, she said. I hope that's all right. It's fine, Daniel said. What kind of piece is it? Human interest primarily, but with a real business angle. I'm looking at people who are building something meaningful in the current economic climate, people who are doing it differently from the standard playbook. Another pause. I also spoke briefly with Christine Park at Maison Laurel. She mentioned that you'd left the restaurant's employee effective last night and that the circumstances were, her word, extraordinary. Daniel processed this. He had not yet told Christine he was leaving, which meant Calloway had. When did you speak to Christine? He said. About an hour ago. Why? He thought about Richard Calloway making a phone call this morning. Moving pieces before Daniel was aware the board had shifted. Not maliciously practically, but still. No reason, he said. What are you looking for from me specifically? An interview. An hour, maybe 90 minutes. I'd like to see the shop, hear the story, understand what you're building, and why. And I'd like to ask about last night if you're open to that. Daniel was quiet for a moment. His first instinct was no. He was a private person. He had spent 4 years making himself small and careful, and oriented entirely toward what was in front of him, not toward any kind of visibility. The idea of a newspaper article felt like someone turning a light toward a thing he had been protecting in the dark. His second thought was Elena's voice, clear as it ever was. You can't help people who don't know you exist. He thought about the skills program, about the community repair center on Mia's graph paper, about Sarah starting Monday, about the people who brought him things that mattered to them and trusted him to make them whole. Visibility wasn't about him. Next week, he said. Wednesday afternoon. Come to the shop. Perfect, Diana Park said, and the warmth in her voice moved up slightly from underneath the professional. Mr. Mercer, for what it's worth, everyone I've spoken to so far has used the word honest. I don't hear that word this many times in one morning. Tell them I said thank you, he said. He hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand and thought about how the shape of a single Thursday evening had continued to change things in every direction, still moving outward, like something dropped in water. He was not naive about what was happening. He had read enough, paid enough attention to enough business stories to know that capital and media attention arrived together sometimes, and that the combination created momentum that could carry a thing forward faster than it was ready to go. He had seen it happen to other people's businesses, the rapid expansion that outpaced the foundation, the story that was bigger than the reality it described. He was going to have to be careful. He was going to have to stay true to the thing actually was, even as it became something larger. He wrote that down too. Stay true to what it is, not what it looks like from the outside. He pinned both pieces of paper to the corkboard above his desk, next to Mia's drawing, which he had also pinned there, because it was the clearest version of the vision he had seen. He looked at the three things together: his daughter's dream of a building, his note about staying true, and the drawing of small figures outside the entrance, rendered in pencil by a 9-year-old who had not yet learned to doubt what she made. His phone buzzed again. Marcus Webb term sheet is done early. Richard said to send it tonight. Attaching now. He also said, and again, his words not mine, that you should read page 7 specifically before anything else. Daniel opened the attachment. He read to page 7. He stopped. Page 7 was not a standard term sheet clause. It was a separate section clearly written by Calloway himself rather than drafted by legal. The language was different, less formal, more direct. It was titled simply, Community Investment Addendum. It read, in recognition of the operational and community investment model described by D. Mercer on April 18th, Calloway Capital commits to matching community reinvestment contributions at 100% for the first 3 years of the agreement. This matching commitment is unconditional and not subject to performance benchmarks. Below that, in what appeared to be a personal note rather than formal language, the skills program was your idea. The matching is mine. Consider it a belated correction. Daniel read it twice. He set the phone down. He looked at the corkboard. He thought about a man who had snapped his fingers at a waiter and had, in the span of less than 24 hours, moved from that gesture to this one. It was not a small distance. It was not a distance that most people traveled in a day. He thought about what he had said in the car. People showed you who they were in the arrangements they made. He picked up the phone. He typed to Marcus, tell Richard I read page 7. Tell him thank you. And tell him the correction isn't belated. It's right on time. He sent it. He sat back. Outside, he could hear the neighborhood doing what neighborhoods did on a Friday afternoon. Kids coming home from school, a lawnmower 2 houses down, a dog barking at something that probably wasn't worth barking at. The ordinary machinery of ordinary life running alongside everything that was changing. The front door opened at 3:47. He heard the backpack hit the floor. Dad. Kitchen, he called. Mia appeared in the doorway. She was wearing her school uniform, with the collar slightly askew, her hair partially escaped from its morning braid, her shoes untied in a way that suggested she had untied them at some point during the day and couldn't be bothered to retie them. She looked exactly like herself, which was to say, she looked like the most important person in any room she walked into. She looked at the corkboard. You put my building up there, she said. I did. She walked over and looked at it more closely. She looked at the 2 pieces of paper he'd pinned beside it. What are those notes, he said. Ideas. She read them. She was a fast reader. Elena's genes. She looked at the one that said, Location to Community Repair Center Concept. Skills Program. Small library. Rooftop element. She looked at her drawing. She looked at him. You're copying my idea, she said. I'm building your idea, he said. She thought about this distinction for a moment. That's different, she said. Yes. Do I get credit? You get credit and equity, he said. When you're 18. She looked at him with the specific expression she deployed when she was deciding whether something was being said seriously or not. Equity, she said. Your drawing is on the corkboard, he said. That's the founding document. She looked at the drawing again. Then she looked back at him. Dad, she said. Yeah. Is something happening? He looked at her. This was the thing about Mia that had always slightly undone him the way she noticed. Not just the surface of things, the texture underneath. Elena had been the same way, that particular quality of attention that made you feel both seen and slightly accountable for what being seen revealed. Yes, he said honestly. Something is happening. Good something or scary something. He thought about it. Both, he said. She nodded very seriously. Okay, she said. What do we do? He looked at his daughter, at the girl who drew buildings on graph paper and dreamed community centers and corrected the voices in bedtime reading, and already at 9 years old had the instinct to ask, what do we do, rather than what do you do? He thought about Elena asking him, what do you want, Daniel? He thought he was beginning to know the answer. We have dinner, he said, and then we talk about it. Mia pulled out her chair and sat down. I want pasta, she said. I know, he said, and I want to hear everything, she said, not the short version. I know, he said again. He got up and started the water boiling, and the Friday afternoon moved around them, and the corkboard on the wall held the three things together: the drawing, the notes, the vision of something that had not yet been built, but was already in some essential way real. Because someone had seen it. And sometimes that was how everything started. The Seattle Times article ran on a Tuesday. Daniel found out at 6:43 in the morning because his phone started making sounds it had never made before. Not individual buzzes, but a continuous rolling vibration that eventually slid the phone off the nightstand entirely. He picked it up from the floor, looked at the screen, and spent approximately 3 seconds trying to understand what he was seeing before he understood. Diana Park's piece had gone live at midnight. By 6:43 a.m., it had been shared 4,200 times. The headline read, "He spoke 5 languages to a billionaire and changed the terms of the room. Now he's changing his neighborhood." He lay on his back on the bed and read the article on his phone with the specific stillness of a man trying to assess something that was moving faster than assessment allowed. Diana had done her job thoroughly and honestly. She had the shop, the story, the investment, the community program. Sarah, the Grundig radio, and the woman whose father's voice was frozen in metal and wire. She had Mia's drawing described but not shown. She had Calloway's confirmation of the deal, which meant Calloway had spoken to her directly, which was its own piece of information. She had the restaurant, the wine, the snap of fingers, the 5 languages. And she had one quote from Daniel himself from their Wednesday interview that she had placed at the very end of the piece, the last line before the publication credit, which was the position reserved for the thing you wanted the reader to carry with them after they put it down. The quote was, "I'm not building an empire. I'm building something my daughter can point to and say that's what my dad did with the worst years of his life." He read that line twice. He had said it. He remembered saying it. But seeing it in print at the end of a story that thousands of people were apparently reading before 7 in the morning did something to the air in the room that he hadn't anticipated. His phone rang. A Portland area code. He didn't recognize it, but he answered. "Mr. Mercer. This is Tom Aldrich. I own 4 appliance repair franchises in the Oregon market, and I've been looking for a partnership model for expansion into Washington. I just read the Times piece, and I want to talk to you." "It's 6:45 in the morning," Daniel said. A beat. "I know. I'm sorry. I can call back." "Call Marcus Webb," Daniel said. He gave the number from memory. "He handles my business inquiries." He hung up. He lay there for another 30 seconds. Then his phone rang again. Different number. He let it go to voicemail. Then another. Then a text from Marcus. "I've already gotten 11 calls. Did you see the article he texted back? I'm looking at it now. Marcus Richard wants to talk this morning. He's pleased. But also there's something else. Can you come to the office at 9? Daniel looked at that last line for a moment. He's pleased, but also. The but, also. He texted, "I'll be there at 9. He got up. He made coffee. He stood in the kitchen in the early morning quiet and thought about the word that had been placed at the center of his story by someone else, someone who had interviewed him for 90 minutes and listened carefully and decided correctly that the word that explained everything was honest. He wondered if Elena would have laughed at the irony of it, that the quality she had spent years quietly pressing him to own was now the thing 8,000 strangers were reading about before their first cup of coffee. He thought she probably would have laughed. He thought she also would have said, "Don't let it change what you're building." He poured his coffee. He stood at the kitchen window. He watched the street come alive in the way it did every morning. The ordinary procession of people beginning their days, none of whom knew yet that the man in the house with the repair shop had woken up this morning with his life a slightly different shape than the one it had been when he fell asleep. At 7:15, Mia came downstairs. She poured herself cereal, with the focused competence of a child who had been doing this since she was 6 and considered parental assistance an insult. She sat down. She ate 3 bites. She looked up at her father standing at the window with his coffee and said, "You look like something happened." "Something happened," he said. "Is it the article?" He turned. You knew about the article. Diana Park told me about it when she came to the shop, Mia said. She asked if she could describe my drawing. I said yes, but only if she said it was my idea. He stared at his daughter. She did say that, he said, in paragraph 12. Mia nodded. I know. I read it at 6:30. You were awake at 6:30. I set an alarm, she said, and went back to her cereal. He sat down across from her. Mia? He said. Yeah. How do you feel about it? She thought about this the way she thought about most things, seriously, without rushing. I feel like people are going to come to the shop now who don't know us, she said. And some of them are going to be good, and some of them are going to want something. And you're going to have to tell the difference. He looked at his 9-year-old daughter. That's exactly right, he said. I know, she said, and finished her cereal. He dropped her at school at 7:55. She got out of the car, shouldered her backpack, walked 3 steps, turned around. Dad. Yeah. Mom would think this was funny. He didn't say anything for a moment. The best kind of funny, he said finally. Mia nodded, like this confirmed something she had already decided. She walked into school without looking back. He sat in the parked car for a moment with his hands on the wheel, looking at nothing. Thinking about a woman from Lyon who had taught him to argue in 2 languages and to pay attention to what mattered, and who would have absolutely thought this was the best kind of funny. Then he drove to Callaway Capital. The building was exactly what you would expect from a man who had built $2.4 billion from scratch glass and steel, and the particular altitude of ambition made physical. The lobby had the cool, precise air of a place designed to communicate importance before anything else happened. The receptionist knew his name before he said it. The elevator opened before he reached it. He rode to the 34th floor in a silence that was engineered to feel like money. Marcus Webb met him at the elevator. He's in the conference room, Marcus said. Is there something I should know before I walk in? Daniel said. Marcus looked at him with the expression of a man who had learned to give information efficiently. There are 3 other people in there, Marcus said. Callaway didn't tell me he was inviting them. I found out 20 minutes ago. Who are they? Marcus paused. Investors. 2 are existing Callaway Capital partners. The 3rd I don't know personally, but her name is Dr. Amara Cole. She runs a non-profit called Future Trades, which focuses on workforce development and vocational training for underserved communities. He paused again. Given your community skills program, I think the connection is obvious. Did Callaway tell her about the program? He must have. Daniel was quiet for a beat. Okay, he said. Are you all right with this? I'm about to find out, Daniel said. He walked into the conference room. Richard Callaway was at the head of the table. The 3 other people turned when Daniel entered 2 men in suits who had the look of people who had made their money in things Daniel would have needed to research to fully understand, and a woman in her late 40s with close-cropped natural hair and the quality of attention in her eyes that reminded Daniel immediately of the way serious people in serious fields looked at the world. Present, analytical, not unkind, Daniel Callaway said, standing. He did not snap fingers. He stood. Richard, Daniel said. The introductions were made. The 2 men were Thomas Reeves and Carl Nakamura, both senior partners. Dr. Amara Cole extended her hand to Daniel and held it a fraction of a second longer than a standard handshake, which was the specific gesture of someone meeting a person they had already decided they wanted to understand. I read the article, she said. Most people apparently did, Daniel said. Something in her face relaxed. She had been waiting to see if he was going to be performative about the attention. The directness apparently satisfied her. They sat. Callaway looked at Daniel. I want to be transparent about why I asked these 3 to join. Thomas and Carl are evaluating whether to expand their involvement in the Mercer repair deal, not to change your terms, which stand as agreed, but to increase the total capital pool, which would accelerate the 2nd location timeline. Amara is here because Future Trades has infrastructure. We don't have program design community trust relationships with vocational education networks, And because the skills program you described is something she has been building toward from a different direction. He paused. I should have told you they'd be here, he said. I didn't. That was wrong. The directness of it landed in the room differently than an apology would have. It was a statement of fact about his own behavior, delivered without decoration. Daniel looked at him for a moment. It's all right, he said. But going forward, if there are going to be people in a room about my business, I need to know in advance. Agreed, Calloway said. Thomas Reeves leaned forward. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the specific confidence of a man who had been in a great many rooms and very rarely been surprised by what happened in them. He looked at Daniel with the slightly appraising quality of someone running an evaluation. Mr. Mercer, he said, I've reviewed the term sheet and your financials. Your margin is impressive for the model. My question is scalability. A repair business runs on the reputation and skill of the individual operator. How do you scale the quality that currently exists in one location, run by one person, to 2, 3, 10 locations without diluting what makes the model work? It was a good question. Daniel respected it. The answer is the skills program, he said. I'm not going to hire people off the street and train them in 2 weeks and hand them a wrench. I'm going to build the training program first. Every technician who works for Mercer Repair will go through it. The program establishes a standard technical, ethical, relational. How you treat the object someone brings you. How you talk to a client who's nervous about cost. How you decide whether a repair is worth it or whether honesty requires telling them it isn't. He paused. The quality isn't in me. It's in the approach. The approach can be taught. Reeves sat back. Carl Nakamura, who had been quiet and watchful, spoke for the first time. He was younger than Reeves' mid-50s Japanese-American with the quality of careful observation that suggested he made his best decisions by listening longer than other people were comfortable with. The community piece, he said. The matching contribution, the skills program, the reinvestment structure. That's not standard. It adds cost and complexity. Tell me why it makes business sense, not ethical sense. I can hear the ethical argument. I want the business argument. Daniel looked at him directly. Loyalty, he said. Not the abstract kind. The specific transactional kind that turns into something deeper. When a business invests in a community, real investment, not a check to a charity at Christmas, that community becomes the business's most aggressive marketing department. They protect you. They send you their family members. They defend you when something goes wrong. They tell strangers to trust you before those strangers have any other reason to. He paused. I can show you the numbers. Customer acquisition cost in a word-of-mouth model is a fraction of any paid marketing alternative. The community reinvestment pays for itself within 3 years and then becomes pure margin advantage. Nakamura was quiet for a moment. And the intangibles, he said. The intangibles are that I can look my daughter in the eye, Daniel said. Which isn't your concern commercially, but is mine personally, and the two aren't separable in this business, because this business is me. Another silence. Then Nakamura nodded once slowly and looked at Reeves, and something passed between them that was not visible in language. Dr. Amara Cole had been watching Daniel through all of this, with the focused attention of someone building an accurate model of another person in real time. Can I ask you something different? She said. Please, Daniel said. The people you want to train, she said. Who are they in your mind? When you picture the first cohort of students in your skills program, who do you see? Daniel didn't hesitate. I see a 53-year-old woman who worked on an assembly line for 22 years and can no longer do the physical work because of an injury to her shoulder, he said. I see a 24-year-old man who aged out of foster care with a high school diploma and a very limited network. I see a woman in her 40s who immigrated here from somewhere that her credentials don't transfer, who is working 2 service jobs and is exhausted and capable of far more than either job requires. He paused. I see people who are good with their hands and good with problems and have never been given the framework that would make those qualities into a livelihood. Dr. Cole was looking at him. That is exactly who we work with, she said quietly. I know, Daniel said. I read about Future Trades 2 years ago. I've had your website bookmarked for 18 months. I didn't know how to approach you. The room was very still. Calloway was looking at Daniel with the expression that Daniel had come to recognize as his genuine one, the one without the performance layer. Dr. Cole looked at Calloway. You didn't tell him I'd be here, she said. Not quite a question. No, Calloway said. And he knew who I was anyway. Apparently. She looked back at Daniel. I have a program design, she said. Curriculum assessment tools, community outreach framework, employer relationships for post-program placement. What I don't have is a business that will absorb graduates and give them a real track, not just a certificate. She paused. You have the business. You need the program. I think we should talk. I think so too, Daniel said. Thomas Reeves put both hands flat on the table, which appeared to be his version of a decision gesture. Carl and I will double the capital pool, he said. Same terms, same conditions, same operational autonomy. We're in. The room absorbed this. Daniel looked at the 4 people across the table from him, the billionaire who had snapped his fingers and then spent 3 days moving toward something different, the 2 senior partners who had just made a decision in under 30 minutes based on a conversation, and the woman who had been building toward this from a direction none of them had predicted. He thought about the corkboard in his kitchen, the drawing, the notes, the small figures outside the building that Mia had drawn with a pencil on a Friday evening. He thought about how much of this had started with a bottle of French wine and a single moment when he had decided that the most important thing in a room was rarely the loudest thing. I have one question, he said. Calloway looked at him. Go ahead. Why now? He said. The article ran 6 hours ago. You clearly made calls before I walked in. You moved fast. Why? Calloway was quiet for a moment. Because in 40 years of business, he said, I have learned that the window between when something is real and when everyone else recognizes it is real is very small. And in that window, the people who move are the people who end up in the story. He paused. You are real, Daniel. I recognized it Thursday night. I am not going to wait for 12 other people to figure that out before I act. It was the most direct thing the man had said in Daniel's presence. Daniel nodded. All right, he said. Then let's talk about what we're building. They talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, the shape of something real had emerged, not a pitch, not a projection, but an actual plan with actual people attached to it. Dr. Cole's program integrated from the start. Reeves and Nakamura's capital structured for a 2-year build-out. Sarah, as operations manager with the scope of her role, now expanded to include program administration alongside the business systems. The second location, slated for a neighborhood 2 miles east in a building that Nakamura mentioned offhandedly he happened to own and had been trying to figure out what to do with. When they finally stood and shook hands, Calloway walked Daniel to the elevator. They stood waiting for it in the particular quiet of a hallway outside a room where something had just been decided. How are you feeling? Calloway asked. Like someone opened a door and the room on the other side is much larger than I expected, Daniel said. Calloway looked at the elevator doors. That's an accurate description of most good decisions, he said. The elevator arrived. Daniel stepped in. Richard, he said. Calloway looked at him. The Margot, Daniel said. The night at the restaurant. You poured a glass for me. I remember. No one had done that in 4 years, Daniel said. Not like that. Not as an invitation, rather than a transaction. Calloway was very still. I don't know if you knew what you were doing, Daniel said. But it mattered. The elevator doors started to close. I didn't know, Calloway said quietly before the doors met. But I'm glad. The doors closed. Daniel rode down alone in the engineered silence. He walked through the lobby and out into the Seattle morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the air, which was cool and carried the particular smell of the city after rain. He called Sarah. She answered on the second ring. How did it go? The scope of your role just expanded, he said. A pause. How much? Significantly, he said. I'll explain everything tonight. Are you free at 7? Yes, she said. And then after a brief pause, Daniel, are you all right? He thought about that. I think I'm better than all right, he said. I think I'm just not used to it yet. Get used to it, she said firmly. He smiled at the sidewalk. Working on it, he said. He hung up and started walking toward the parking garage, and his phone rang again almost immediately. He looked at the screen. A New York number. He answered. Mr. Mercer. A man's voice slightly hurried the rhythm of someone who made a lot of calls in a short amount of time. My name is Philip Anand. I'm an editor at The Atlantic. I read the Times piece this morning, and I want to commission an essay from you, your words, your story, the philosophy of what you're building. We'd want it by end of next month, roughly 3,000 words. We pay well, and we have 7 million readers. Daniel stood on the sidewalk. He thought about what he had said to Diana Park in the 90-minute interview. He thought about the things he had said that she hadn't used, the things he'd said about Elena, about grief, about what it felt like to build something real out of the worst years of your life. He thought about Dr. Cole's students, the 53-year-old woman with the shoulder injury, the 24-year-old who had aged out of foster care. He thought 7 million readers. He thought the skills program needs people who believe in it before they walk in the door. Send me the contract, he said. Excellent, Anand said. I'll have it to you by end of day. And Mr. Mercer, I want you to know, the piece doesn't have to be triumphant. It doesn't have to be a success story. It can be honest. Honest is the only way I know, Daniel said. I know, Anand said. That's why I called. He got to the parking garage. He sat in his car for a moment before starting it. He pulled out his phone and texted Mia Bigday. Tell me about yours at dinner. The reply came back in 4 minutes, which meant she had checked her phone at lunch. Mine was good. We did fractions. I already knew fractions. Also, Tyler said my building drawing was cool. He said it like he didn't want to, but he couldn't help it. Daniel looked at that for a long moment. He texted back. Tyler has good taste. Also, fractions are important, even when you already know them. Mia. Why? Daniel. Because understanding why something works is different from being able to do it. A longer pause this time. Mia. That's pretty deep for a Tuesday. He laughed. Actually laughed alone in a parking garage at his 9-year-old daughter's assessment of his philosophical output. He started the car. He drove back to the shop and the city moved around him. And somewhere in the forward motion of the drive, he had the specific sensation of a life that was reorganizing itself not into something unrecognizable, but into a truer version of what it had been reaching toward for 4 years. Not a triumph. That was not the right word. More like an arrival. He parked in front of the shop. He unlocked the door. He walked to the workbench and picked up the Grundig radio and carried it to his stool and sat down, and began the careful, patient work of making it whole. His hands knew what to do. They had always known what to do. The rest was just the world catching up. He worked in silence for an hour, and then his phone buzzed once. He glanced at it. Marcus Webb. One more thing. Richard asked me to pass this along and said you'd understand the context. Below the text, Marcus had forwarded an email. The email was from Richard Calloway to his daughter Catherine, sent at 8:51 that morning, less than an hour before Daniel had walked into the conference room. It said, I'm coming to help you move in August. I should have asked first, and I'm sorry I didn't. I'd like to see your apartment before it becomes yours if that's possible. I'm not asking for more than that. I just don't want to keep calling twice a year on schedule. Your father. Daniel read the email. He set the phone face down on the workbench. He picked up a small screwdriver. He went back to work. And in the particular quiet of the shop, with the city moving outside and the radio slowly coming back to itself under his hands, Daniel Mercer thought about the strange and non-linear way that honesty moved through a room, how it started in one place and ended up somewhere entirely else touching things. It had no plan to touch, changing the temperature of conversations it was never meant to be part of. He thought about a snap of fingers and a $4,000 bottle of wine. He thought about 5 languages and a changed translation. He thought about a man sitting in a car at midnight saying the name Patricia for the first time in 2 years. He tightened a small screw. He tested a connection. From somewhere inside the old radio, a sound moved. Faint. Not music yet, but signal. The frequency was there. It just needed to be found. The Grundig radio came back to life on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the article ran. Daniel was alone in the shop when it happened. He had the back panel off the wiring cleaned and resoldered the capacitors, replaced with period-correct components he had sourced from a supplier in Ohio who specialized in vintage electronics restoration. He powered it up carefully, the way you approach something fragile that has survived a long time by being handled well. The static came first. Then through the static, a signal weak hunting finding its range. He adjusted the tuning dial by increments so small they were almost imaginary. And then, suddenly cleanly, a voice. A jazz program on a public radio station. The host speaking low and easy between tracks, and behind the host's voice, a trumpet finding its way through a melody that was 60 years old and still true. Daniel sat back on his stool. He listened for a moment. Then he picked up the phone and called the woman who had brought it in. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she answered on the 3rd ring. And when he told her it was ready, she went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with bad news. He could hear her breathing, and then he could hear her trying to compose herself, and then she said in a voice that was doing its best, "Can I come today?" "Come whenever you want," he said. She was there in 40 minutes. She walked in, and Daniel led her to the bench and turned the radio on, and she stood there with both hands pressed flat to her sternum, listening to whatever was playing, and her eyes did what eyes do when something that was gone comes back. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "He used to listen to this exact station. I don't know how that's possible, but he did." Daniel said, "Some things find their way back." She looked at him. She looked at the radio. She opened her purse to pay, and he told her the amount, and she said it wasn't enough, and he said it was the amount, and she looked at him in the way that meant she understood that this had been about more than money from the beginning. She left with the radio wrapped carefully under her arm. He stood in the shop after she was gone and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing completed, not a transaction, not a number in a column, but a thing that was broken and was now whole, returned to someone who needed it to be whole for reasons that had nothing to do with function and everything to do with love. He thought, this is what I am building. Not a franchise, not a scalable model. This, repeated, expanded, taught to other people who understand it in more neighborhoods, for more Margarets, who are carrying things that need to come back. His phone buzzed. Sarah. The building permit for location 2 came through. Carl Nakamura's office just called. "We can start build-out in 3 weeks." He read it twice. Then he texted back, "Call a team meeting for Friday morning. You, me, Amara Cole's program director, and the 3 staff. Let's talk about what we're building before we start building it." Sarah, already on it. "Also, you have a 2 o'clock today. Walk-in, wouldn't give a name. Said he knew you from the restaurant." He thought about who that could be. James Fontaine had returned to Paris. Marcus Webb had his number and would have called. Calloway himself had his number and also would have called. He texted back. What did he look like? Sarah, late 60s. Drove himself, which surprised me because the car was very nice. Wearing a jacket with no tie. Said to tell you he reads the Journal every morning. Daniel went very still. Thomas Reeves. He had not heard from Reeves directly since the conference room meeting. The deal had proceeded through Marcus, through lawyers, through the clean mechanical process of capital moving from one place to another. Reeves had been professional and efficient and entirely absent from anything personal. He texted Sarah, "Tell him I'll be back by 1:30. Keep him comfortable." He arrived at 1:22. Reeves was sitting in the reading chair in the corner, the same chair Calloway had pulled to the table weeks ago with a cup of coffee from the machine in the back that Sarah had apparently offered him. He was reading something on his phone, not performing patience, just actually patient. He looked up when Daniel walked in. "You found the place all right," Daniel said. "GPS," Reeves said. "And the article. Your shop looks exactly like it did in the photographs." Daniel hung up his jacket. "What can I do for you, Thomas?" Reeves set his phone down. He looked at Daniel with the particular directness of a man who had made a decision in advance and was here to deliver it rather than negotiate it. "I have a son," he said. Daniel waited. 31 years old. His name is Patrick. He spent 3 years in the Navy, came home, couldn't find a direction. He's been working retail for 4 years, and he hates it, and he's good with his hands, and he has no idea what to do with that. Reeves paused. "I've offered to pay for any school he wants. Any training program, any certification. He won't take money from me." "Why not?" Daniel said. "Because I wasn't there when he was growing up," Reeves said. It came out with the flatness of a fact that has been held long enough that the pain has compressed into something denser than sadness. "I was building what I built, and his mother raised him, and he is a man now who is uncomfortable receiving things from me because he spent 20 years not receiving them." Daniel said nothing. "I read your essay in The Atlantic," Reeves said. The essay had run 2 weeks prior. Daniel had written it at his kitchen table over 5 evenings. Mia asleep, the house quiet, his hands on the keyboard, instead of a screwdriver for once. It had been the most personally exposed writing he had ever done. Not comfortable, but true. He had written about Elena, about grief with a direction, about what it meant to repair something that was broken versus replacing it with something that wasn't, about the difference between value and price, about how his daughter had dreamed his business plan on graph paper and how he had understood looking at it that the most important things always begin with someone seeing something that isn't there yet. 7 million readers. He still could not fully feel the reality of that number. "Patrick read it too," Reeves said. "He called me afterward. He hasn't called me just to talk in 3 years. He paused. "He asked if I knew you." Daniel understood now why Reeves was here. "You want him in the program," he said. "I want him to have the option," Reeves said carefully. "I'm not asking you to give him special treatment because I'm an investor. I'm asking you to let him apply the same way anyone else applies. If he doesn't qualify, he doesn't qualify." "The program doesn't have formal qualifications yet," Daniel said. "We're still building the assessment framework with Dr. Cole's team. The first cohort starts in 4 months." "I know the timeline. I have the operational reports." "Then you know we're prioritizing applicants from specific demographics, people who are underemployed or unemployed people without access to traditional educational pathways." Reeves looked at him. "Patrick qualifies on the second criterion. He has a high school diploma and 3 years of military service and 4 years of retail work and no clear path forward. The fact that his father has money doesn't give him access to opportunities that nobody has offered him." Daniel considered this. "Send him to Sarah," he said. "Application process same as everyone else. If he's serious about it, that will be clear from the application. If he's doing it to make you feel better, that will be clear too." Reeves nodded. "One more thing," he said. "Go ahead." "I want to apologize to you," Reeves said. Daniel blinked. "In the conference room," Reeves said, "I tested you. The questions I asked, they were real questions, but I asked them to see how you responded to pressure from someone with capital, not because I actually doubted your business case. I knew the business case was solid before I walked in. I'd read everything." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're building something that requires trust," Reeves said. "And trust requires honesty about the way people behave when they think they have leverage." He paused. "I behaved like a man with leverage. You should know that so you know what you're dealing with." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. "I knew," he said. Reeves raised an eyebrow. "The questions were too clean," Daniel said. "Too precisely calibrated. You already knew the answers. You were watching how I handled being watched." He paused. "I decided it didn't matter. The answers were true either way." Reeves was quiet. Then he said, "Richard was right about you." "What did Richard say?" "He said you were the first person he'd met in 20 years who was completely unimpressed by wealth, but completely respectful of the person. He said those two things almost never go together." Reeves stood. He extended his hand. "Patrick will contact Sarah this week." Daniel shook it. "I hope he's serious about it," Daniel said. "Not for your sake, for his." "So do I," Reeves said. After Reeves left, Daniel stood in the shop for a moment in the quiet. Then he went to the workbench and picked up the next job, a vintage turntable belt drive platter slightly warped, brought in by a man who said his wife had given it to him on their first anniversary, and he wanted it working before their 40th. He started with the belt. He was halfway through the assessment when the door opened and Mia walked in. This was new. 3 weeks ago, when the second location's build-out had begun absorbing more of Daniel's daytime hours, they had adjusted the after-school arrangement. Sarah picked Mia up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays and brought her to the shop where Mia had claimed a corner of the back room as her design studio, spreading graph paper across a folding table with the proprietary confidence of someone who had been here from the beginning. Because she had been, in her own way. She came in now with her backpack and her Tuesday expression, which was focused and slightly impatient with the world for not moving fast enough. "How was school?" Daniel said. "We learned about compound interest," she said. "I already knew compound interest." "Of course you did." "But I asked Mrs. Torres what the most important thing to compound was, and she said money, and I said, what about trust? And she looked at me like I'd said something in a different language." Daniel set down his screwdriver. "What made you think of trust?" he said. Mia dropped her backpack in the corner. "Because you always say that relationships compound, and relationships are built on trust. So it follows that trust compounds." She said this with the easy logic of someone who had not yet encountered the world's tendency to complicate obvious things. "Right. Right," he said. She looked at him. "You're doing the face," she said. "What face?" "The face you do when something I say makes you think about Mom." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have said the exact same thing," he said. "Word for word." Mia considered this, not with sadness, with something more like recognition. The way you recognize a feature in a mirror. "Good," she said, and went to her corner and started drawing. He went back to the turntable. They worked in the same room in the specific, companionable silence of two people who had been doing this long enough that the silence was a form of conversation. At 4:47, his phone rang. Richard Calloway. He answered. "Are you at the shop?" Calloway said. "I am." "Catherine called me back." Daniel waited. "She said yes," Calloway said. "To August." She said, a pause, and in the pause, something that was not quite Calloway's usual voice, something that had been stripped of its management. "She said she'd been waiting for me to ask." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "She'd been waiting for me to ask," Calloway repeated, as if hearing it again made it more real. 3 years of twice-yearly scheduled calls, and she was waiting for me to ask. "People usually are," Daniel said. "Waiting. They just can't say it first." "I didn't know that." "I didn't either," Daniel said. "Elena had to teach me, several times." A silence. "She sounds extraordinary," Calloway said. "Your wife." "She was," Daniel said. "She is. The present tense still works for me." Another silence, longer. "I'm going to visit her grave," Calloway said, "before August. I want to. I don't know exactly why. It feels like something I need to do." Daniel was very still. "You don't have to explain it," he said. "I know. But I'm telling you because you're the only person I know who would understand it." "I understand it," Daniel said. "She changed the room," Calloway said. "From wherever she is. She changed the whole room." Daniel looked across the shop at Mia, who was bent over her graph paper, drawing a building she had not yet named, filling in windows one by one with the patient certainty of someone who knows exactly what she's making even before it's finished. "That's what she does," he said, They were quiet for the moment together on the phone. The two of them, the billionaire who had learned the name of his own grief, and the single father who had been carrying it with grace for 4 years, both of them holding something that the other had helped make real. "Daniel," Calloway said. "Yeah." "Thank you." He didn't say for what. He didn't need to. "You're welcome," Daniel said. He hung up. He set the phone on the workbench. He looked at the turntable, at the belt in his hands, at the careful work waiting to be finished. He picked up the screwdriver. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in October, the second location of Mercer Repair opened. It was not a grand opening in the commercial sense. There was no ribbon, no press release, no sponsored content. What there was a neighborhood and neighbors, and a building that had been a vacant storefront for 2 years and was now something else. Sarah had organized the morning with the precise, warm efficiency that had become her signature in 3 months on the job. Dr. Cole's team had set up a table near the entrance where people could learn about the skills program. The first cohort started in 6 weeks, and all 12 spots had been filled within 48 hours of the application opening. Patrick Reeves was one of them. His application had been thorough, specific, and honest about why he wanted in and what he expected from himself. Sarah had flagged it for Daniel without commentary. Daniel had read it and approved it without commentary. The connection to Thomas Reeves was not mentioned in the application. Possibly Patrick didn't know his father had visited the shop. Possibly he did, and had decided it didn't matter. Either way, the work would be what it was, separate from who his father was, which was the only way it could be real. Thomas Reeves came to the opening. He stood near the back and watched and did not draw attention to himself, which, given who he was a deliberate choice that Daniel noticed and respected. Calloway came too. He arrived quietly. No car, no Marcus Webb, just himself in the jacket without a tie. And he walked through the space the way he had walked through the repair shop, taking inventory, building a picture, deciding what things meant. He stopped at the skills program table and talked to Dr. Cole for 15 minutes. Daniel watched from across the room and could see from the quality of Calloway's attention that he was learning something he hadn't expected to learn. Amara Cole had that effect on people. Mia was there in her good clothes, which she had selected herself, which meant they were her version of good rather than Daniel's, which meant she looked exactly like herself. She had brought her portfolio of drawings, not just the community repair center, but everything she had drawn in the month since. She had set them up on a board near the entrance, without anyone asking her to, and was standing beside them, explaining them to anyone who stopped with the calm authority of someone at a professional presentation, rather than a 9-year-old at her dad's store opening. At one point, Daniel walked by and heard her telling an older man, "The rooftop garden is load-bearing in the emotional sense, not the structural sense. It tells people the building cares about more than the ground floor." The man was nodding seriously. Daniel kept walking. Margaret Chen came. She brought the Grundig radio turned on, tuned to jazz, which she set on the small table near the entrance because she had asked Daniel if that was all right, and he had said yes without hesitating. The music moved through the new space, old and steady and real. At some point in the late morning, Daniel found himself standing in a quiet corner of the room just watching Sarah move through the crowd with her clipboard and her capability. Watching Dr. Cole's team explain the program to people whose faces changed as they understood what was being offered. Watching Mia holding court by her drawings. Watching Calloway standing alone for a moment near the window, not performing, not managing, just looking out with the particular expression of a man who is thinking about something true. Sarah appeared at Daniel's elbow. "How are you feeling?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "Like this is real," he said. "It is real," she said. "I know. That's what's strange about it." She looked at him with the direct, steady attention she brought to everything. "You know what I think," she said. "Tell me." "I think you built this for Elena," she said. "And I think that's exactly right. And I think she would have very specific opinions about the layout of the skills room." He laughed. It came out full and real. "She absolutely would," he said. "She would have moved the workbenches. She always moved the workbenches." Sarah smiled. She moved back into the crowd. He stood alone for another moment. He thought about a Thursday night in a restaurant and a man who snapped his fingers at a waiter. He thought about how different that night could have been, how easily he could have been a different person, how easily he could have deflected, gone small, taken the path that required nothing. He thought about the translation he had chosen to give instead, not the message he had been handed, something truer, something that opened a door instead of closing one, and everything that had moved through that open door since. He thought about Elena in the specific way he thought about her when something had happened that she needed to know about. He tried to hear her. He usually could eventually. What he heard was not words. It was more like a quality of light, the feeling of being recognized by someone who knew you all the way through, who had decided you were worth knowing before you had fully decided it yourself. He held that for a moment. Then Mia found him. She pushed through the crowd with the focused navigation of someone who has places to be stopped in front of him, looked up at him with her dark eyes that were so much her mother's. It was sometimes hard to breathe. "The man by my drawings asked if I was going to be an architect," she said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was going to be whatever built the most real things," she said. "He said, 'What does that mean?' I said I'd figure it out." Daniel looked at his daughter. "That," he said quietly, "is the right answer." She tilted her head. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Are you happy?" He looked around the room. At the people. At the music from the old radio. At Sarah and Amara and Calloway and Thomas Reeves standing near the back watching his son's name on an enrollment list. At the drawings on the board by the entrance. At the building that had been empty and was now full. He looked back at Mia. "Yes," he said, and meant it without qualification for the first time in a long time. She nodded once, satisfied, and went back to her drawings. He stood in the room that his daughter had dreamed on graph paper, and his wife had made possible by showing him what mattered, surrounded by people who had come from unexpected directions and arrived at the same place. And he understood, not abstractly, but in the specific physical way of something finally settling, that this was what it looked like when a broken thing came fully back. Not perfect, never perfect, but whole. And sometimes whole was more than enough. Sometimes whole was exactly everything. Because the man who had once stood invisible at table 12 with a notepad in his hand had learned one honest moment at a time that the most important thing in a room was never the loudest thing. It was the true thing. And true things once spoken have a way of changing every room they enter, forever.